Welcome, delegates, to the Kesson Coalition. Here, our fate will be decided.
Let me tell you something before we begin, because you deserve the truth, and the truth is this. I have watched 1,000 species stand in front of the trial construct, and I have watched 1,000 species find a reason, any reason, to walk away from it. I have seen generals cry. I have seen kings fake illness. I have seen a Vorn diplomat 3 meters tall, covered in natural armor plating, suddenly remember an urgent appointment he did not have. So when I tell you what happened on the day the humans arrived, understand that I am not exaggerating, because frankly I do not need to. The truth alone is embarrassing enough for the rest of us. My name is Bram. I am technically a counselor of the Trial Observance Committee, which is a fancy way of saying I sit in a very comfortable chair and narrate disasters for a living. It pays well. The chair is excellent. And on the day in question, I was about to witness the single most humiliating afternoon in the recorded history of the Coalition. I intend to tell you every single detail, because someone has to, and honestly, it might as well be me. I have narrated a great many trials in my time, and I want to be clear that most of them are entirely forgettable. A species arrives, a species fights competently or does not. A species joins the coalition or returns home to reconsider its ambitions, and life on Kesson continues exactly as it always has, undisturbed by whatever small dramas play out in that pit each season. I mention this only so you understand how unusual it is for me to still be thinking about a single afternoon this many months later, still turning it over in quiet moments the way you turn over a stone you cannot quite put down. I have tried, on several occasions, to write this account with more professional distance than I am currently managing. I have failed each time. I suspect, by the end of this telling, you will understand why. Let us start with the arena itself, because context matters. The trial grounds sit on a neutral moon called Kesson, chosen centuries ago because it belongs to no one, and because nothing important grows there, which, if you ask me, tells you everything about how much thought went into planning this whole tradition. The arena is a massive circular pit ringed with observation platforms built from a metal that does not scratch, does not burn, and apparently does not care how many skeletons get left inside it. Above the pit floats the construct itself, a machine built so long ago that nobody currently alive remembers who actually built it. Only that it works exactly as advertised every single time, without exception, without mercy, and without the faintest shred of humor about the whole affair. The purpose of the combat test is simple, at least on paper. Any species wishing to join the wider coalition, to trade, to travel, to sit at the big important table where decisions get made, must first send one representative into that pit to face the construct. The machine studies its opponent for exactly 10 seconds, scales its abilities to match, and then the fight begins. It is meant to prove courage. It is meant to prove resolve. Mostly, in my experience, it proves that most species are excellent at giving speeches about courage and considerably worse at actually demonstrating any. Now, you might be wondering why a species would ever agree to something so obviously terrifying. The answer is pride, mixed with a healthy dose of not wanting to be the first ones caught backing out in front of the entire coalition. Which, ironically, is exactly what happened that day, over and over again, in front of everyone, on a recording that I am fairly certain still circulates through certain corners of the galaxy purely for entertainment purposes. The morning began with Administrator Galrath standing at the podium, adjusting his ceremonial collar for what must have been the 40th time, because Galrath, bless him, has never once in his long life resisted the urge to be dramatic. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing across the amphitheater, and announced the day's proceedings in that booming, self-important voice he saved specifically for occasions like this. "Representatives," he said, "today we welcome several new applicant species into consideration for coalition membership. Each delegation will provide one combatant. Let the trials begin." And so they did. First up was the Thraxian delegation, a proud, heavily armored species with 4 arms, thick natural plating, and a reputation for being nearly impossible to injure in melee combat. Their chosen combatant strode into the pit with tremendous confidence, chest puffed, all 4 fists clenched, looking every bit like a champion. The construct studied him for its usual 10 seconds. Then it extended a single thin appendage, tapped him gently on the shoulder, and the Thraxian warrior immediately dropped to one knee, clutching his shoulder, and loudly announced that he had, quote, pulled something important during warm-ups. He was carried out on a stretcher. He walked in under his own power. Nobody, and I mean nobody, believed a single word of that explanation. But protocol says the trial ends whenever a combatant withdraws. So withdraw he did with maximum dignity, which is to say none at all. Next came the Ilaroon delegation, a telepathic species so proud of their mental abilities that their representative walked in wearing what I can only describe as ceremonial robes designed purely to look intimidating, while doing absolutely nothing useful in an actual fight. The construct powered up. The Ilaroon representative closed his eyes, presumably to focus his psychic energy, and instead of engaging, simply turned around, walked directly back out of the pit, and informed the judges that his species does not, quote, participate in tests that measure physical violence, as it conflicts with our philosophical principles. Which is a wonderful excuse, except that same delegation had spent the previous evening at the banquet loudly bragging about how their ancestors once conquered 3-star systems through pure combat prowess. Philosophical principles, apparently, only kick in once the fighting becomes personal. Then there was the Corvin delegation, a species I had genuinely never seen attempt the trial before. Small, quick, insectal things with a reputation for cleverness rather than strength. Their combatant approached the pit slowly, tapping something on a wrist device, and announced with great solemnity that the trial could not proceed because, according to his calculations, the current alignment of Kessen's twin suns created a magnetic interference that would, quote, unfairly disadvantage a species so reliant on precise neural timing. Several of the judges actually checked the readings, out of pure professional obligation, and found absolutely nothing wrong with the magnetic field whatsoever. The Corvin representative was informed of this. He nodded gravely, said the interference must simply be undetectable by our primitive instruments, and left anyway. There was, too, a Marivex representative, a tall, willowy creature from a species famous for its elaborate honor code, who stood at the pit's edge and delivered what I can only describe as a full 7-minute speech about the sacred nature of single combat, the ancestral traditions his people upheld, and the deep spiritual significance of choosing one's battles wisely. By the time he finished speaking, the 10-second scan had long since completed, and the construct had simply been standing there, patiently, calibrated and ready for the better part of 6 minutes. He concluded his speech by announcing that true honor lay not in reckless combat, but in the wisdom to recognize when a battle did not need to be fought at all, then bowed deeply to the judges and walked away to a smattering of confused applause from his own delegation, who had clearly been hoping for a different ending. Not long after him came a representative from the Kessick Combine, small, quick creatures who move in tight, coordinated groups back home and rarely, if ever, fight alone. Their chosen combatant stood at the edge of the pit for a long moment, looking distinctly uncomfortable, before finally admitting, with what sounded like genuine embarrassment, that his species simply does not send individuals into solitary combat under any circumstances, and that whoever had agreed to these trial terms on their behalf several decades earlier had clearly never consulted an actual member of the species before signing anything. Galrath, visibly exhausted by that point in the morning, simply waved him off without argument. I could go on, and honestly I will, because it only gets better from here. The Dorun delegation sent a representative covered head to toe in weaponized exoskeleton armor, humming with visible energy, practically radiating menace. He stepped up to the pit's edge, looked down at the construct, looked back at his own delegation, and simply said out loud in front of everyone, "No." Just like that. No speech, no excuse, just a flat, honest, refreshing no before turning around and walking back to his seat. I will admit, out of everyone that day, I respected him the most. At least he didn't waste anyone's time pretending. Then the Ashkari sent their combatant, a towering four-eyed brute known throughout their home system for having never lost a duel. He entered the pit, flexed dramatically for the cameras, and then, upon seeing the construct's 10-second scanning sequence begin, suddenly clutched his chest and collapsed to the ground, insisting he was suffering from what he called pre-existing cardiac irregularities. His own medical team, standing right there in the crowd, looked utterly baffled, because as far as anyone knew, Ashkari physiology does not actually include a cardiac system remotely similar to what he was describing. There was also the Kel Vash delegation, a species covered in dense natural fur, known throughout the coalition for their impressive size and their even more impressive reputation for wrestling large predatory beasts back on their home world for sport. Their combatant entered the pit looking every bit the champion, roaring once for effect, which admittedly was a nice touch. The construct began its scan. The Kelvash representative watched those 10 seconds tick by, and somewhere around second 8, he suddenly announced loudly that his species observes a strict cultural custom, forbidding combat on days when the local moon sits at a certain angle in the sky. Nobody, including several members of his own delegation, had ever heard of this custom before. He was escorted out to polite, disbelieving applause. Then came the Voranthi, a species so proud of their diplomatic history that they rarely bothered training for physical combat at all, relying instead on centuries of careful negotiation to avoid ever needing to. Their combatant, a rather thin, wiry individual, stepped up to the pit's edge, studied the construct for exactly 1 second, turned to Galrath, and calmly requested a formal 15-minute recess to, quote, properly prepare mentally for the engagement. The recess was granted. The combatant did not return from it. When questioned afterward, the Voranthi delegation simply stated that he had, and I quote directly from the official record, stepped outside briefly and lost track of time. I want to be fair here, because not every excuse that day was pure cowardice dressed up in fancy language. The grand delegation sent forward an elderly warrior, genuinely respected across several systems for decades of honorable service, who looked at the construct, looked at his own aging joints, and simply admitted, with more dignity than anyone else managed that entire morning, that he no longer possessed the physical capability to survive such an encounter, and withdrew without excuse or embarrassment. I respected that one too. It was, without question, the most honest moment of the entire proceeding, right up until Eli Voss reached the edge of that same pit. By this point, Galrath was sweating through his ceremonial collar, glancing nervously at General Tavak, who commanded the coalition's military observation unit and was, by all appearances, losing his patience at an alarming rate. Tavak was an old soldier built like a slab of granite, missing one eye from some ancient campaign nobody dared ask him about, and he had exactly zero tolerance for cowardice dressed up as ceremony. "This is becoming an embarrassment," Tavak muttered, loud enough for the row behind him to hear. "We have 6 delegations remaining, and I would wager every single one finds a reason to withdraw before the construct so much as twitches." He was almost right, almost. 5 more delegations went through the exact same humiliating routine. Sudden injuries, sudden philosophical objections. One representative claimed a translation error meant he thought he'd signed up for a cooking competition, which frankly deserves some kind of award for creativity, even if nobody believed him for a second. Another simply fainted the moment the construct's scanning lights turned on, and had to be revived by his own delegation, who seemed less concerned than embarrassed. By the time the 6th alien delegation finished their withdrawal, the entire amphitheater had settled into a kind of exhausted, cynical silence. The sort of silence you get when everyone in the room already knows exactly how the rest of the day is going to go. And then it was the human's turn. Now I need to be honest with you about something, because I promised you the truth, and I intend to keep that promise. Nobody in that amphitheater expected anything from the humans. Nobody. Humans were, at the time, still considered the Coalition's charity case, a species allowed to attend these proceedings mostly out of politeness, mostly because excluding them outright would have looked cruel on record. They had no natural armor, no claws, no psychic abilities, no exoskeletons humming with dangerous energy. Just soft skin, fragile bones, and from what everyone had heard, a rather embarrassing tendency toward emotional overreactions at the smallest provocations. So when Commander Hale walked the human delegation into the amphitheater, there was, and I want to be precise here, actual laughter. Not polite laughter either. Open, unrestrained laughter from at least 3 different delegations. The kind of laughter you make no effort to hide because you assume the target of your mockery either cannot understand you or simply does not matter enough to care. Commander Hale, for what it's worth, did not react to any of it. He simply stood at attention, arms folded, expression unreadable, while Galreth cleared his throat once more and asked the inevitable question. Humanity, Galreth announced, in a tone that practical. Lie dripped with condescension. Who will represent your species in the trial? And here is where the day stopped being funny and started being something else entirely. Because the human delegation, this small group of maybe 15 unremarkable-looking people standing at the edge of the pit, shuffled slightly, and out from somewhere in the middle of the group stepped a girl. Not a soldier in obvious armor, not someone covered in medals or ceremonial markings. Just a young woman, average height, dressed in simple civilian clothes and a plain jacket, who walked forward with absolutely no hesitation whatsoever. Her name, according to the manifest later provided to the judges, was Ellie Voss. I remember distinctly thinking, at the time, that this had to be some kind of mistake, perhaps a scheduling error. Perhaps the humans had misunderstood the assignment entirely and thought they were sending forward a translator or an assistant or anyone other than an actual combatant. She looked, and I say this with no exaggeration, like someone who had wandered in off the street looking for the nearest food court. The laughter in the amphitheater got louder. Ellie Voss ignored it completely. She walked to the very edge of the pit, looked down at the construct floating silently below, and then, without a word, without a speech, without so much as a dramatic pause for effect, she reached up, unzipped her jacket and pulled it off, tossing it back toward Commander Hale, who caught it without so much as blinking. Galreth actually stopped talking mid-sentence. I saw it happen. His mouth was open, ready to continue the ceremonial announcement, and it simply stayed open, frozen, because nobody in the entire recorded history of the trials had ever removed their jacket before. It wasn't part of any ceremony. It wasn't required. It was, as far as anyone could tell, simply something she did because she intended to move, and a jacket apparently gets in the way of moving. Is this some sort of joke? I remember whispering to the counselor seated beside me. He shrugged. Nobody knew. Nobody had a script for this. The judges flustered, exchanged glances, checked their databases, confirmed that yes, technically, removing an article of clothing violated no rule whatsoever. And so, with visible reluctance, Galreth cleared his throat again and announced that the trial would proceed. The construct began its 10-second scan. Now understand something about the construct because it matters for what happens next. The machine does not simply look at a combatant's size or species. It measures everything: reflexes, muscle density, reaction speed, historical combat data if available, and calibrates its own abilities to match a fair, if brutal, fight. For the Thraxian, it had generated crushing force. For the Ashkari, blinding speed. For every species that day, it had built itself into a worthy, terrifying opponent, scaled precisely to their strengths. 10 seconds passed. The construct extended its limbs, and I swear, for just a moment, something about its movement seemed hesitant, though machines, of course, do not hesitate. It simply calibrated. That is all it does. It calibrates and then it acts. Ellie Voss rolled her shoulders once, cracked her neck to the side with an audible pop that somehow carried across the entire silent amphitheater, and settled into a low, relaxed stance that looked, disturbingly, like she had done this exact thing 1,000 times before, in 1,000 rooms far less impressive than this one. The construct struck first, a blindingly fast strike aimed directly at her center mass, the same opening move it had used against nearly every combatant that day, the move that had in the past ended fights before they properly began. She was not there when it landed. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I certainly had to. One instant she stood directly in the construct's path. The next instant, the construct's strike hit empty air, and Ellie Voss was somehow half a step to the left, completely unbothered, watching the machine's follow-through with what could only be described as mild, almost bored curiosity. The crowd, which had been laughing just moments earlier, went completely silent. The construct adjusted faster this time, throwing a combination of strikes meant to overwhelm through sheer volume rather than raw power, the same tactic that had crushed the confidence of at least 2 earlier combatants. Ellie moved through it like water moves around stone, small adjustments, minimal wasted motion, never quite where the machine expected her to be, occasionally allowing a strike to graze close enough that the crowd gasped, only for her to slip the actual impact by mere centimeters every single time. General Tavak, sitting rigid beside Galrath, leaned forward in his seat, his single eye narrowed, studying her movements with the intensity of a man who had spent his entire life reading combat. And Rhea. Ding something he clearly did not like in what he was seeing now. "She's not fighting the machine," he said quietly, to no one in particular, though I happened to be close enough to hear it. "She's studying it." He was right. Anyone with a trained eye could see it by the third exchange. She wasn't reacting purely on instinct or panic, the way most combatants do when facing something built specifically to destroy them. She was watching, adjusting, learning the construct's patterns in real time, the way you might study an opponent across a dozen matches, except she was doing it within a single minute, live, in front of an audience that had already written her off as an afterthought. Somewhere in the 4th or 5th exchange, I noticed something that made the hair along my neck ridge stand up, if I still had a neck ridge worth mentioning, which, being a counselor and not a soldier, I mostly do not. Ellie Voss had started talking. Not shouting, not screaming battle cries the way half the earlier combatants had before losing their nerve entirely, just talking quietly, almost conversationally, as though she were narrating the fight to herself the way someone narrates a recipe while cooking. "Okay," I heard her mutter, ducking under a strike aimed at her head. "That's twice you've led with the left now." She rolled beneath a follow-up sweep, popped back up onto her feet without so much as a stumble, and added almost cheerfully, "You're going to want to stop doing that." The construct did not stop doing that. Machines, as I mentioned, do not take advice. It led with the left a third time, and this time Ellie Voss caught the strike mid-motion, twisted her entire body around the joint of its arm, and used the machine's own momentum to slam it face first into the arena floor with a crack that echoed through the entire amphitheater like a thunderclap. She stepped back, shook out her wrist once, and glanced up toward the observation platform with an expression that somehow managed to be both apologetic and faintly amused at the same time, as though she felt slightly bad about how easy this was turning out to be, but not bad enough to stop. The construct, sensing its opening strategies weren't working, escalated. This is what it does. This is what it has always done, scaling its output whenever a combatant proves more capable than initially calculated. It began moving faster, striking harder, deploying combinations built from centuries of combat data pulled from 1,000 different species across 1,000 different trials. And Ellie Voss began to smile. Not a grim, determined smile. Not the tight expression of someone fighting for survival. An actual, genuine, faintly amused smile, the kind you might wear while doing something mildly enjoyable, like solving a puzzle you already suspect the answer to. She let the construct's next strike come close, closer than any before it, close enough that half the amphitheater audibly gasped, myself included. And then, at the very last possible instant, she caught its striking limb with both hands, pivoted her entire body using the machine's own momentum, and threw it. Actually threw it. An ancient combat construct, built to withstand and dominate any species in the coalition, several meters across the pit floor. The impact cracked the arena's reinforced flooring. Nobody said a word. Nobody laughed. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my long career sitting on this committee. The construct rose again immediately, recalibrating because it does not feel pain, does not feel embarrassment, does not understand the concept of being humbled in front of an audience. It simply adjusts and continues, which in this case meant it began generating output levels I had genuinely never seen it use before. Not against the Thraxian, not against the Ashkari, not against anyone. Administrator Galrath, watching the display readouts from his podium, went visibly pale. "The output levels," he stammered. "Those numbers are reserved for extreme threat classifications. That's meant for—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but everyone in that amphitheater understood exactly what he meant. Those numbers were meant for situations the coalition considered genuinely dangerous, not for a young woman in a plain shirt who had, until several minutes ago, been the punchline of the entire event. Somewhere around the seventh exchange, I noticed Galrath's hand shaking against the edge of the podium, not from fear exactly, or at least not only from fear, but from the particular kind of vertigo you feel when a lifetime of assumptions collapses all at once in front of an audience of your peers. He had presided over hundreds of these trials. He had watched dozens of combatants, some magnificent, some pitiful, but he had never once watched a fight where the outcome felt this uncertain this early, and never against a combatant who looked this thoroughly unbothered by the experience. I glanced over at the Ashkari delegation at one point, mid-fight, purely out of professional habit, the way you check a room for reactions during any significant event, and found their entire front row sitting in dead silence, the same delegation that had watched their own combatant fake a cardiac emergency not 20 minutes earlier. None of them were laughing anymore either. I do not think anyone in that amphitheater was laughing by the seventh exchange. The Maravek's representative, the one who had given his lengthy speech about the wisdom of choosing one's battles, sat with his hands folded very tightly in his lap, watching with an expression I can only describe as quiet, dawning regret. The fight continued, and here is where I struggle to properly describe what I witnessed, because language, even after everything I have seen in this position, feels insufficient. The construct threw everything it had. Every combination, every escalation, every trick built from centuries of combat against countless species. And Ellie Voss met each attempt with something that looked less like combat and more like conversation, an ongoing back and forth, where she seemed to understand exactly what the machine intended to do a fraction of a second before it did it. She was not simply surviving. She was controlling the pace of the entire exchange, occasionally landing strikes of her own, precise, efficient, clearly not intended to showcase brutality for its own sake, but rather to end things as quickly and cleanly as possible. Twice she had openings to inflict what would have been catastrophic damage, and twice she pulled back at the last instant, redirecting the force into the construct's less critical components instead. I noticed that. I want you to notice it too. She was not trying to destroy the machine. She was trying to end the fight without unnecessary destruction, which, if you think about it, is a far more unsettling thing to witness than pure aggression would have been. Aggression, at least, is something we understand. Restraint, deliberate, controlled restraint from someone capable of far worse, is something else entirely. By the time the construct made its final, desperate escalation, pouring every remaining resource into a single overwhelming strike meant to end things through sheer force, Ellie Voss simply stepped inside its reach, redirected the blow harmlessly past her shoulder, and delivered a single precise strike to the machine's central processing core. A strike so exact it seemed almost surgical. The construct went still, its internal lights dimmed, its limbs lowered. For the first time in longer than anyone in that amphitheater could recall, the trial construct had been rendered inactive, not destroyed, not obliterated, simply and completely defeated, shut down by someone who, by every outward measure the coalition had used to judge species for centuries, should never have been capable of such a thing. Ellie Voss straightened up, brushed a bit of dust off her shirt, and turned to look up at the stunned crowd surrounding the pit, offering a small, almost apologetic shrug, as though she wasn't entirely sure why everyone looked so shaken. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, General Tavek stood up from his seat slowly, deliberately, and I watched this proud, battle-hardened commander do something I had genuinely never seen him do before in all my years knowing him. He removed his ceremonial cap and held it respectfully against his chest, a gesture of acknowledgement reserved traditionally only for combatants who had proven themselves worthy of genuine respect. That, he said, his voice carrying across the silent amphitheater, was not luck. He was right, of course, though it would take several more hours of frantic private discussion among the delegations before anyone was willing to say it out loud. What we had just witnessed was not an anomaly, not a fluke, not some rare exceptional human plucked from her species specifically for this event. Commander Hale, when questioned afterward, seemed almost confused by the sheer volume of questions directed at him. "She's not our best fighter," he said, shrugging, as though this fact should have been obvious. "She works logistics mostly, wasn't even supposed to be on this trip. Her transport got rescheduled last minute." I remember the room's reaction to that particular statement, because it was somehow more unsettling than the fight itself had been. An entire amphitheater full of delegations representing dozens of species, who had each in turn spent the morning inventing increasingly desperate excuses to avoid facing the construct, now had to sit with the knowledge that the species they had openly mocked, the species everyone assumed was a charity case, had sent, essentially by scheduling accident, someone who was not even considered particularly exceptional by her own people's standards. Demonstrator Galrath, still visibly shaken, attempted to regain some semblance of ceremonial composure. "The humans," he announced, his voice noticeably less confident than it had been that morning, "are hereby granted provisional membership into the coalition, pending further review." Further review, as though there was anything left to review after what we had just witnessed. Within an hour of the trial ending, the Coalition's Security Council convened an emergency closed session, the kind normally reserved for actual border disputes or confirmed acts of aggression between member species. I was not technically permitted to attend, but my role on the Observance Committee affords me certain small privileges, and one of those privileges is a chair just outside the council chamber door, close enough to hear most of what gets said when voices rise even slightly above a murmur. And that day, voices rose quite a bit. I heard at least 4 different council members demand an immediate reassessment of humanity's provisional membership status, though I noted with some interest that not one of them suggested denying membership outright. Their concern, as far as I could tell through the door, was not whether humans deserved to join the coalition. It was whether the coalition had any real understanding of what it was inviting in. One voice, which I later identified as belonging to a senior Vorn strategist, kept repeating the same question in slightly different phrasing each time. If this was an ordinary representative, sent by scheduling accident, what does an extraordinary one look like? Nobody in that room had an answer, and the silence that followed each time he asked it was, from what I could hear, considerably longer than any silence a council meeting typically produces. Later that evening, after the official proceedings had ended, and most delegations had retreated to their quarters to quietly panic among themselves, I found myself standing near the edge of the now empty pit, staring down at the still, dormant construct, trying to make sense of everything I had seen. General Tavek joined me, uninvited, staring down at the same broken machine with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know what troubles me most," he said without looking at me. "It wasn't her strength. Plenty of species here could match her strength given the right conditions. It was how calm she was. She never once looked afraid, not for a single moment." I nodded slowly because he was right, and because I had been turning that exact thought over in my own mind since the fight ended. Every other species that day had approached the trial with visible dread, an understanding, deep and instinctive, that they were about to face something dangerous, something worth fearing. And every one of them had ultimately chosen to avoid that danger entirely, whatever the cost to their dignity. Ellie Voss had approached the exact same danger and had simply removed her jacket first, as though preparing for something no more significant than an afternoon workout. "Do you think she's unusual, even by their standards?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Tavek was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Commander Hale said she wasn't even their best fighter. If that's true, and I have no reason to doubt it, then we didn't just lose today. We learned something about an entire species that I'm not certain any of us are prepared to properly understand." I should mention, before moving on, what happened to the Thraxian warrior who had faked his shoulder injury that same morning, because I think it says something worth saying. I encountered him quite by accident 2 days later, in one of the station's quieter observation lounges, sitting alone, watching a replay of the human trial on a small personal viewer, the kind delegates use when they do not want to be seen watching something too closely. He noticed me approaching and did not bother turning it off, which surprised me. Most delegates in his position would have. "I could not have done that," he said, without any prompting from me, nodding toward the frozen image of Ellie Voss mid-throw. "Even if I had actually fought instead of pretending my shoulder was injured. I want you to understand that clearly. It was never really about the injury." I asked him carefully what he meant. "I saw the way it moved during the earlier calibration," he said. "I knew, the moment it looked at me, that it was going to hurt badly and that I would very likely lose. So I gave myself an excuse instead. I'm not proud of it, but I wanted on your record, counselor, that I was afraid, plainly and simply, and that pretending otherwise this morning would be a worse dishonor than admitting it now." He paused for a long moment, still watching the frozen image. "What troubles me is that she must have known the exact same thing I did, watching that scan complete, and she took her jacket off anyway." I did not have a response for him then, and I still do not have a particularly good one now. I wrote his statement down almost exactly as he gave it because I thought, and still think, that it captures something the official records never quite managed to. Fear, real fear, was present in that amphitheater all morning, on nearly every face that walked up to that pit. The difference with Ellie Voss was never that she felt none of it. I suspect, quietly, that she may have felt exactly the same thing everyone else did. The difference was simply what she chose to do with it, which is, I have come to believe, the only difference that has ever really mattered in these trials at all. Word of what happened at Kessin spread fast, faster than I expected, honestly, given how the coalition usually treats these trials as fairly routine administrative business, barely worth mentioning outside official records. But this one was different. Within a single day, delegations from systems that had not even sent representatives to witness the event were requesting full recordings. Within a week, I was fielding formal inquiries from 3 separate military committees, all asking, in various carefully worded diplomatic phrasings, some version of the exact same question. How many more of them are like her? I did not have a good answer for them then. and I am not entirely certain I have one now. What I can tell you is what happened during the closing banquet that same evening, because it tells you almost as much as the fight itself did. The human delegation was seated, as tradition dictates, at one of the smaller tables near the edge of the hall, the placement itself a quiet, lingering insult left over from before the trial, back when nobody expected humanity's presence to matter much at all. Nobody had bothered to move them to a more prominent table, likely because nobody had time to update the seating arrangements before the event started. Ellie Voss sat there throughout the entire banquet, eating quietly, occasionally chatting with the rest of her delegation, seemingly unbothered by the fact that half the room kept sneaking glances in her direction, like she might at any moment suddenly decide to demonstrate something else terrifying, entirely unprompted, over dessert. At one point, a young Thraxian attaché, presumably emboldened by whatever passes for liquid courage among his species, approached her table and asked through a translator how she had learned to fight like that. I was close enough to hear her answer, and I have thought about it constantly ever since. I didn't really, she said, shrugging. Grew up somewhere rough. You learn a few things, mostly just so you don't get hurt. Never really thought of it as fighting, just paying attention. Just paying attention. That was her explanation for single-handedly dismantling a machine that had, until that day, been considered functionally unbeatable by every species present. General Tavak, seated a few tables away, must have overheard the exact same exchange, because I caught him afterward quietly requesting an updated threat assessment be drafted regarding humanity's home world, its population, and specifically its baseline civilian population. Not its military, its civilians, the ones who supposedly had not been specifically trained for any of this. There was another moment during that same banquet, one I nearly left out of this account entirely because it seemed, at the time, almost too small to matter. Late in the evening, after most of the delegations had drifted into smaller conversations, and the formal portion of the meal had long since ended, I noticed Ellie Voss quietly helping one of the serving staff, a young Corvin attendant who had dropped an entire tray of glassware near the human table. She knelt down without hesitation, gathered the broken pieces with her bare hands, and helped stack the surviving glasses back onto the tray before the attendant had even fully processed what had happened. The attendant, clearly mortified at having made a mess in front of the delegation everyone in the hall was still quietly terrified of, kept apologizing in increasingly frantic tones. Ellie simply told him it happened to everyone, that trays were heavier than they looked, and asked whether he needed help carrying the rest of it back to the kitchen. I bring this up because I think it matters just as much as the fight itself, in its own quiet way. An entire amphitheater had spent that morning assuming humanity was harmless because it appeared weak, and by evening had begun assuming humanity was dangerous because it had proven otherwise. Neither assumption, I have come to believe, fully captures what I actually witnessed that day. What I witnessed was a species that did not seem to measure the world in terms of strength or weakness at all, not in the way the rest of us instinctively do. Ellie Voss handled a rogue combat construct and a drop tray of glassware with what are to be the exact same quiet, unhurried attention. I am not certain the coalition has fully reckoned with what that actually means yet. I am not certain I have either. I think about that conversation often, even now, months later, as humanity's presence within the coalition continues to grow, as more delegations quietly, cautiously begin adjusting their expectations around what an average, unremarkable human might actually be capable of when circumstances demand it. We had spent that entire morning laughing, mocking, assuming the worst about a species we understood the least, and by the time the sun set over Kessin that evening, not a single delegation in that amphitheater was laughing anymore. Somewhere out there, Ellie Voss is probably still doing logistics work, filing reports, catching connecting transports, living an entirely unremarkable human life, completely unaware, or perhaps simply unconcerned, that an entire galaxy of species now quietly, carefully makes absolutely certain never to underestimate her kind again. And honestly, if you ask me, that might be the single most terrifying detail buried within this entire story. It wasn't that humanity sent a warrior into that pit that day. It was that they sent someone ordinary, and ordinary for humans turned out to be more than enough. I have sat through hundreds of trials since that day. Counselor Bram, official record keeper, professional witness to other people's humiliation. And I can tell you without exaggeration that none of them have ever quite matched the strange, quiet dread that settled over the coalition after Kessin. Not fear in the way you fear a monster, something clearly dangerous, something you can point at and understand. This was something slower, something that crept in gradually over weeks and months, the kind of fear that comes from realizing you have been laughing at the wrong species for centuries, and nobody had the decency to warn you sooner. Delegations began requesting private briefings on human culture almost immediately, poring over records, histories, anything that might explain what we had witnessed. And the frustrating part, the part that kept certain very important committees awake at night, was that there was no singular answer waiting to be found. No secret training program, no hidden elite unit quietly disguised among ordinary civilians. Just an entire species that had, through whatever brutal accident of evolution and history shaped their home world, produced an awful lot of people capable of remaining perfectly calm while staring down something built specifically to end them. I remember one particular briefing, weeks later, where a junior analyst from the Ilaroon delegation, the same delegation that had walked out of the trial citing philosophical objections, stood up in front of a room full of senior officials and asked, quite earnestly, whether it was true that humans could not sense danger the way other species could. I watched Tavek's expression when that question was asked. He did not laugh, though I suspect he wanted to. Instead, he said quietly that it was not that humans could not sense danger. It was that they had apparently decided as a species that danger was simply something you dealt with once it arrived, rather than something you spent your whole life trying to avoid. The room went very quiet after that. Nobody had a good response. Administrator Galrath, to his credit, adjusted rather quickly. Within a month, he had personally proposed a full review of humanity's coalition status, recommending accelerated integration rather than the usual decades-long probationary process reserved for newer species. I asked him once, privately, what changed his mind so completely in such a short time. He simply looked at me and said, "I watched that girl remove her jacket like she was preparing for lunch, Bram. I decided I would rather have humanity as an ally than ever find out what happens when they are not." The formal integration ceremony, when it finally happened some months later, was a considerably quieter affair than I expected, given everything that had led up to it. I suppose part of me anticipated some grand, symbolic gesture, a ceremonial acknowledgement of just how thoroughly the coalition's assumptions had been overturned in a single afternoon. Instead, it was a modest signing, a handful of officials, a handful of human representatives, Commander Hale among them, and a short, unremarkable speech from Galrath that made no mention of the trial at all. I asked him afterward why he had chosen not to reference it, given how directly it had shaped the entire proceeding. "Because it was never really about the fight, Bram," he told me, straightening a stack of newly signed documents. "The fight was just the first moment we were forced to notice something that had probably been true about them all along. I did not think it needed repeating in a formal ceremony. I think everyone in that room all read. Why understood it perfectly well." I noted, with some quiet amusement, that Ellie Voss was not present at the integration ceremony at all. When I asked Commander Hale about her absence, he informed me, without the slightest hint of irony, that she had been reassigned to a supply route audit on the opposite side of human territory, and that rescheduling her for a ceremonial signing had simply not been considered a priority by anyone involved. herself included. I found something oddly fitting in that. The single most consequential combatant in the recorded history of the trials, quietly filing paperwork somewhere several systems away, while an entire coalition rewrote its assumptions in her absence. I think that sums up the entire affair rather neatly, better than I ever could on my own. I want to tell you about one more trial before I finish, because I think it belongs here, even though it happened many months later, on a different moon entirely, with none of the same delegations present. A newer species, the Havinar, arrived seeking coalition membership, having heard, as most species eventually do, second-hand rumors about the human girl who had dismantled the construct without ever losing her composure. They did not believe the rumors. I want to be clear about that because it matters. They assumed, as almost everyone eventually does upon first hearing the story, that it had been exaggerated somewhere along the retelling, the way these things always are. So when their own trial came around, and a human representative happened to be present that day as an observer rather than a combatant, one of the younger Havinar delegates approached him during the recess and asked, with obvious skepticism, whether the story about the girl and the jacket was actually true, or whether it was simply something humans told to make themselves sound more impressive to newer species. The human representative, an unremarkable-looking man in his 40s who I later learned worked primarily in agricultural logistics, apparently just shrugged and said that yes, it was true, and that Ellie was, in his words, one of the calmer people back home, honestly. The Havinar delegate laughed at that, assuming it was some kind of joke, a piece of dry human humor he had not yet learned to recognize. He stopped laughing rather quickly once he realized the man was not joking at all. I bring this up not because anything dramatic happened at that particular trial. It did not. The Havinar combatant fought competently and lost with reasonable grace, but because of what happened afterward during their own closing banquet. I was invited to attend as an observer, and I watched the same young Havinar delegate spend the better part of an hour quietly interrogating every human at the table about ordinary, mundane details of daily human life. What an average human did for work, how humans typically resolved disagreements, whether calmness under pressure was something taught or something simply expected. He was not looking for another Eli Voss. He already understood by that point that there likely wasn't just one. He was trying to understand what an entire civilization built around that particular kind of calm might actually look like from the inside, and I do not think by the end of that evening he had fully managed it. I am not certain any of us have. There is one more thing I feel obligated to mention, mostly because I think it says more about the aftermath than anything else I have described so far. Several weeks after the trial, a formal delegation from the Kelvesh, the same species whose combatant had invented a moon-angle custom on the spot to avoid the fight, requested a private audience with the human delegation, not to challenge them, not to save face. They came, according to the transcript I later reviewed, to formally apologize for underestimating a species they had never bothered to properly study, and to request, somewhat sheepishly, whether humanity might be willing to share whatever training methods produced someone like Eli Voss. Commander Hale's response, relayed to me secondhand, was simple. There was no special training method. There was just a species that had learned, over a very long and very difficult history, that panic rarely helps and calm rarely hurts. I did eventually get the chance to speak with Eli Voss directly, some 6 weeks after the trial, purely by coincidence. My duties occasionally require site visits to human-administered logistics stations, mostly dull paperwork verification that nobody else on the committee wants to handle, and it turned out she had been temporarily assigned to exactly the station I was visiting. I recognized her immediately, of course, though she did not seem to recognize me at all, which I found strangely reassuring. She was sorting cargo manifests at a small terminal near the loading bay, dressed in the same kind of plain, unremarkable clothing she had worn at the trial, minus the jacket. I introduced myself, mentioned the committee, and watched her expression shift from polite professional patience into something closer to mild embarrassment. "Oh," she said, "that's still a thing people talk about." I told her it was, in fact, still very much a thing people talked about, possibly the single most discussed event the trial construct had produced in its entire recorded history. She seemed genuinely surprised by this, in a way that I do not believe was performed for my benefit. I asked her, since I had the opportunity, whether she had been frightened standing at the edge of that pit. She thought about the question for a moment before answering, which I appreciated, because most people I interview give me an answer before I have even finished asking. "A little," she admitted. "Mostly I was just trying to figure out what it was going to do first. Once I had a read on that, the rest kind of took care of itself." She shrugged, the exact same shrug I remembered from the banquet all those weeks earlier. "I think people back home would be a lot more impressed by the story if I told them I was terrified the whole time and pushed through it anyway. But that's not really what happened. I was just paying attention, same as always." I asked her whether she ever thought about what might have happened if she had misjudged the machine, even slightly, given the output levels it had eventually reached. "Sure," she said. "I think about that with pretty much everything, though. Doesn't mean you don't do the thing, just means you pay closer attention while you're doing it." She glanced back down at her manifest, clearly ready to return to work, then added, almost as an afterthought, "For what it's worth, I never thought I was going to win, exactly. I just figured I'd rather find out by trying than by guessing." I left that conversation with considerably more questions than I had arrived with, which I suppose is the appropriate way to end any conversation with Ellie Voss. I have since learned that this particular philosophy, try it and find out rather than guess and avoid, is disturbingly common among the humans I have since interviewed for follow-up reports. Not universal. I want to be careful not to overstate the case, but common enough that several committee members have begun referring to it, half-jokingly, as the human default setting, and I am no longer entirely sure the joke is inaccurate. The threat assessment Tavak requested that evening at the banquet did eventually come back, some 3 months later, and I was permitted a limited reading of its summary findings, largely because my own reports were cited extensively throughout it. I will not pretend to understand every technical detail contained within it. Threat assessments are not my area of expertise, but I remember clearly the section that unsettled me most. The analysts had attempted to model, using whatever fragmentary data was available on human civilian populations, roughly what percentage of an average human settlement might be capable of performing under the same conditions Ellie Voss had faced that day. Their conclusion, hedged carefully in the kind of cautious, non-committal language analysts use when they do not want to be blamed later for having said something too alarming, was that they simply did not have enough reliable data to produce a meaningful estimate, and that this uncertainty was, in itself, the most significant finding of the entire report. Tavak, when I mentioned this to him afterward, was uncharacteristically quiet for a long moment before responding. "That is the worst possible answer they could have given me," he said finally. "Not because it is wrong, because it is honest. We do not actually know how many of them there are, and I am no longer certain that not knowing is something we can afford to be comfortable with." I have replayed that recording more times than I would like to admit, sitting alone in my quarters long after the official reports were filed, and the committees had moved on to newer, less unsettling matters. There is a particular moment, right before Ellie Voss removes her jacket, where the camera catches her face for just a fraction of a second.